Hello YouTube, this is Thomas Judge back once again with another YouTube reading guide video. Today is actually a one-off guide or overview, and it's actually the sequel to another one-off guide or overview. A few weeks ago I released a video on what I call the Millerverse, that is to say all the comic sets in the Dark Knight Returns universe created by Frank Miller. However, whilst doing the necessary reading for that, which I had assumed was going to be around 36 issues, I actually discovered there were around another 86 or so issues by DC that are largely considered by the comic book community to be part of the extended Dark Knight Returns universe, but that weren't written by Frank Miller. In the last video, I represented that using this image here, where you can see the core undeniable Dark Knight Returns stories in the middle, as Miller was involved in creating them. So this is what I call the Millerverse. However, they're surrounded by many other stories that are considered by the comic book community at large to be part of the Dark Knight Returns universe. However, many of these tend to drift out of the Dark Knight Returns universe into the main DC Comics universe, or to contradict the Millerverse. And, well, essentially, DC continuity is a complex and murky thing. Whilst many people view the Dark Knight Returns universe as being Earth 31, enough evidence exists to discount that theory that I personally don't use that label. Instead, I just consider it to be the Millerverse, as we discussed last time, and then the wider related or allegedly related issues as one in an extended potential Dark Knight Returns universe. So in a nutshell, the other video I did, the Millerverse video, covers everything that Frank Miller was involved in. And this video, the extended Dark Knight Returns universe, is about all the other stories people often view as being part of that continuity. What I've done here is I've read them all myself, and so I can give you an honest, clear idea as to whether they are part of the Dark Knight Returns universe or not. I'm covering pretty much everything that I've heard anyone mention as being part of this kind of continuity or universe, just because, as I always try to do, the videos I make are the videos that I wished existed when I started a particular project or reading order. And as such, if you are interested in an extended Dark Knight Returns universe read through, you can listen to this video, get a list of all the issues that may or may not be included, get my opinions on whether they are or aren't included, and then make your own choices in your own reading, which I think is probably the key and best way to do that. Now, I'm conscious that you might be expecting a final infographic or a map, but I won't be doing that even at the end of this video. And the reason for that is because it's just too complicated and contradictory. I'll give you an example. If you consider the Terminator franchise, you have all the various Terminator movies. You have Terminator 1, the genesis of it all, I guess. Then you had Terminator 2, which was exceptional. And those two movies make a wonderful pair of movies. It's brilliant, internally consistent continuity from start to finish. Then you have Terminator 3, which is, I guess, a sequel to Terminator 2. It's not very good, but that's not important. Then you have Terminator 4, which is, I guess, a sequel to Terminator 2, but also in a way a sequel to Terminator 3, but kind of not. Then you have Terminator Genesis with a Y, which is the fifth movie in the franchise, which is also a sequel to Terminator 2, but isn't related to Terminator 3 or Terminator Salvation, the fourth one. Anyway, then you have the sixth one, Terminator Dark Fate, again a sequel to Terminator 2. Then you have the Dark Horse Presents Terminator comics, which are set before Terminator 1, during Terminator 1 and 2, and then subsequent to Terminator 2. But again, it branches off from Terminator 2 again. Then you have the Sarah Connor Chronicles, which actually is really good and, slightly gutted that it ended after season 2 and they never got a chance to continue it and close it up. But great 2 seasons. Great show, but again, it's set after Terminator 2 and then goes into another divergent timeline, which by definition is separate to all the other movies. Long story short, there isn't a perfect way of watching the Terminator franchise. You just have to just watch it all and let it just like wash over you, and then you can just kind of work out how you feel about it. People have tried to put maps together. I wouldn't bother with that, and it's the same thing that I'm not going to bother doing for this video with the extended Dark Knight Returns. By the way, as mentioned in the last video, I'm also not going to cover every single obsessive appearance of Dark Knight Returns Batman in a random panel here or a random panel there, because that would mean including stuff like random issues of Zero Hour from 1991 or the Planetary Batman one-shot and random stuff like that. I'm not interested in doing that. It's not in keeping with I think what I feel is an appropriate narrative experience of reading these comics. If you're a Type P reader, which is a term I explain elsewhere when I talk about Type Ps and Type Js, best of luck to you. Go ahead and do that, but I don't need to hear about it because I don't obsessively curate panel appearances. So with all that admin out of the way, where to begin? In other words, who else has written Batman stories set in the wider Dark Knight Returns universe? All right, well, let's just kick off with the ones that people tend to get confused about. Year Two. So Batman Year Two was written by Mike Barr. It's a storyline about Joe Chill, and it came out in 1987, so the year after Batman Year One. I discussed it in my video series on DC Year Ones, but I'll just say now it's definitely not part of the Millerverse, despite the understandable confusion that the misleading title causes. It's not, well, it implies it's a direct sequel to Year One, but the tone is completely different and it's almost goofy. Next up, we have Year Three. This was published in 1989. It was written by Marv Wolfman. It's called Year Three, but it's actually about Robin. I've discussed this again in that same video series on DC Year Ones, but definitely not part of the Millerverse, despite the title, different tone, almost goofy, and the events are just very, very different and contradictory to stuff we've seen in the Millerverse. As a random one shot, I will point out that Catwoman Annual 2 from 1995 is quite closely set in the Millerverse universe. Now, I still stand by that because it's a scene by scene paraquel, and by that I mean it's like a sequel which happens at the same time to the original Miller Year One story. There's some scenes in there that is recreated word for word and beat for beat for things that happen in Year One. Now, it also later leads into the Year Two arc, which we'll talk about now. Catwoman Year 2 came out in 1996, the year after the annual, and it was written by Doug Mensch with illustrations by Jim Ballant. It was set straight after Year 1, which, like I say, I personally consider very much to be a Millerverse linked story, and is also the start of her simmering sexual tension with Batman, as well as her sort of iconic purple costume. Now, notably, there's no Robin, but the Joker, the Penguin, the Bat Signal, the Batmobile, they all exist. Now, this is an explicit story arc set in an ongoing series. It's Catwoman issues 38, 39, and 40. Again, all this is covered in my DC Year One's guide. I know I mentioned that a few times now, but it's something you should check out. And the best rule of thumb for you for going from this series to that one is to remember that not all Year One stories are anything to do with the Dark Knight Returns universe. Let's stay on the Catwoman theme. In 1989, so before the annual and the Year 2 we just talked about, there was actually a Catwoman Volume 1, which was a 4-issue miniseries, the first one to have Catwoman as the title. And this was Selena Kyle's story that getting written by Mindy Newell. I have no idea who Mindy Newell is. Now, like I said, it was published in 1989, established a new origin for Catwoman, based on the earlier Frank Miller work in Year One. So it's quite a departure from classic Catwoman and introduces kind of a new version of the character. It's been collected in a trade paperback called Catwoman: Her Sister's Keeper. It's very much in keeping with the tone of Year One, and it does feature Batman very briefly, although in a slightly more advanced or less rudimental costume than you see in Year One. Overall, though, I wouldn't recommend it because the pacing is awful and the continuity is awful. As in terms of like the internal content, panels and pacings and framing of the story is just a bit of a mess. Um, it's a funny one. I would generally say that the Catwoman annual very linked to the Millerverse, but both Year Two and this Catwoman Volume One from 1989, Her Sister's Keeper, both just kind of diverge into weird directions. As always, keep that Terminator idea in your mind. Like these things aren't neat and aren't tidy. The next one I want to talk about is actually a series called Gordon of Gotham. But in talking about that, I kind of really have to talk about what's called the Gordon of Gotham trilogy. So this is a trilogy of miniseries that's considered to be a trilogy of miniseries. It's connected, it's collected in a trade paperback, which is called the Gordon of Gotham trade paperback. However, it's 3 limited series that are completely different. The first one is Batman GCPD, which was written by Chuck Dixon. It was published in 1996. It mentions Batman and Robin in passing and actually shows him in silhouette in the distance once. And it also shows Matches Malone. Although at this point it's unclear whether Matches is actually Bruce Wayne or not. To be honest, Batman GCPD is a really good story. You should definitely read it. But it's really about Harvey Bullock and Renee Montoya, and it has a very Gotham Central vibe. In fact, it makes me wonder if it inspired Gotham Central. Long story short, if you're a fan of the series Gotham Central, I am. I picked up the omnibus. I think it's great. Then Batman GCPD is definitely something to check out. The next miniseries is also written by Chuck Dixon. It's called Batman Gordon's Law, published in 1996 until 1997, and it was drawn by Klaus Janson. Now, I think this is where some of the confusion comes in, because Klaus Janson is one of the people that worked on Dark Knight Returns as the artwork with Frank Miller. Now, Gordon's Law is set when Babs is in a wheelchair as Oracle, and it's set after Batman recovered from Bane breaking his back. And that takes us into the third of these miniseries, which is the one I think people think much more about when they think of the Dark Knight Returns universe, which is the Gordon of Gotham four-issue miniseries. Now, again, this was drawn by Klaus Janson, but it's not written by Chuck Dixon, it's written by Dennis O'Neil. And this is a story about Jim Gordon prior to his life in Gotham City, and it's often described as a prequel to Frank Miller's Year One. Basically, it kind of depicts the events that drove him from Chicago when he comes to Gotham at the start of Frank Miller's Year One. Now, I know it feels like I'm kind of giving these slightly out of order, but this story is actually set in the current time. In other words, Babs is still Oracle, but the whole story is through a framing mechanism of Jim Gordon reminiscing about the events that drove him from Chicago. So overall, these three are great, well worth reading. I'm going to try and track down a trade paperback myself, but personally, I have no real faith as part of the Millerverse. GCPD definitely isn't. Gordon's Law definitely doesn't seem to be. Gordon of Gotham kind of maybe is. It's a tenuous connection, but there we are. The next thing that people always think is linked to the Dark Knight Returns universe is the series Shaman. Now, Shaman is actually not a series, it's a storyline written again by Dennis O'Neil, the guy who just did Gordon of Gotham. And it was published from November 1989 to March 1990. It was the first 5 issues of what was then a brand new comic book series called Batman Legends of the Dark Knight. Legends of the Dark Knight was a really big deal because it was the first time that Batman had a third monthly ongoing title ever. I know that's hard to imagine now, given that he has like 15 every month without fail. But anyway, so the series was a big deal, and as a whole, it wasn't meant to be happening contemporaneously with the events of either Batman or of Detective Comics. So basically, it allowed writers to throw kind of out of continuity titles in there, or just have self-contained flashback or flash forward issues or stories, exploring characters and ideas that they wanted to. So the opening arc for Batman Legends of the Dark Knight is this 5 issue arc called Shaman, and the particular storyline actually starts very early in the career of Batman. The actual opening is several months before Bruce returns to Gotham to become Batman. And then there's actually a scene which retells the iconic Year One moment of a bat crashing through the window and inspiring Bruce to become Batman. Now, personally, I dislike this quite substantially. And the reason behind this is something which I discuss in another video on my channel called Retrospective Recontextualization. That's both in my playlist for random thoughts and also my playlist for the vocabulary of comics. But long story short, what this story does is it changes that moment where the bat crashes through the window and inspires Bruce. In Year One, the bat crashes through the window and inspires Bruce. In this story, or once you take this story into account, actually there was this whole kind of mystic mumbo jumbo thing going on in Bruce's head from months earlier that was already getting him all mentally primed to think about the bats and becoming Batman and stuff. And frankly, it's weird, it's clunky, it's messy. It lacks the sort of finesse and elegance of Miller's story. That said, because that scene is clearly in here, beat by beat, panel by panel, admittedly with lots of sort of unwanted context around it, we can very clearly say this is linked to the Millerverse. And in fact, later in the story, it flashes forward several months, Batman actually refers to the climactic events of Year One when talking to Jim Gordon. So we can be quite sure this is definitely part of an extended Dark Knight Returns universe, even though it wasn't written by Frank Miller. The Man Who Laughs is it's a one shot which allegedly follows up the ending to Year One by portraying Batman's first meeting with the Joker. So it was published in 2005, written by Ed Brubaker, and is set roughly 1 year after Batman's debut. So it's about James Gordon basically finding himself in a world where Commissioner Loeb has been ousted, costume crime fighters are emerging, and it's meant to be the first actual meeting between Batman and the Joker. It is, but I don't see any Year One DNA in this. It's also worth noting that whether you buy this in trade paperback or hardcover, it's often collected with a detective comic story called Made of Wood, which is issues 784, 785, and 786. I have no idea why that's the case, because that story is utterly unrelated to either The Man Who Laughs or the Dark Knight Returns universe. So, who knows? Next up, we have Dark Moon Rising. This is Matt Wagner's kind of golden age homage to Batman. It's essentially two miniseries that are set between Year One and The Long Halloween, which we'll talk about in a second. The first miniseries is Batman and the Monster Men. The second one is Batman and the Mad Monk. The stories take place somewhere between Year One and The Man Who Laughs, and frankly, I don't really buy it. I don't really see where it links in together. I did read them a while ago, and I remember just finding them very middling and meh. So there you have it. A lot of people think it's part of the Dark Knight Returns universe. I wouldn't give it the time of day, frankly. Okay, and that now takes us to probably the biggest part of the extended Dark Knight Returns universe, the bit that people always talk about and recommend and so on, and that is the Loeb Sale era. So this is the stuff written by Jeff Loeb and drawn by Tim Sale. So let's start off right at the beginning. We have the Legend of the Dark Knight. Remember that series we talked about earlier? Halloween specials. There's three of these that fall within this kind of recommendation of Dark Knight Return stuff. The 1994 special starred Scarecrow. The 1995 special starred the Mad Hatter. And the 1996 special is a really weird one that's basically a riff on A Christmas Carol, which, oh my god, if I had a nickel for every time I read a DC story that was set at Christmas and riffed on The Christmas Carol, Jesus. Anyway, these three specials are all okay, but I couldn't really see an explicit link to the Dark Knight Returns universe. But moving on, they segue very smoothly into The Long Halloween. Jeff Loeb's The Long Halloween continues many of the plot threads of Frank Miller's Year One. It explains the downfall of Carmine Falcone and the rise of costume villains. It's a 13-issue series that continues a lot of the stuff introduced in Year One and continues to be set early in Batman's career. Um, it's kind of considered like maybe a Year Two or a Year Three, I guess. But for my money, I think the way I look at it is it's a murder mystery written by Jeff Loeb, drawn by Tim Sale. The plot follows his struggle, or Batman's struggle, to find a mysterious killer dubbed the Holiday Killer, whilst at the same time it sort of explains a lot more about Harvey Dent and Jim Gordon and the various bits and pieces to do with kind of their life and their backstory, as well as Carmine Falcone essentially kind of getting involved with and hiring the costume supervillains to try to counter Batman. Um, There are 13 chapters to it. I'm showing the screens here, but each one is basically a different day because the premise behind it is that the holiday killer, who this is the heart of the murder mystery, who is the holiday killer? The holiday killer kills people on holidays. So the first issue is called Crime, and then after that, the issues are called in order. They're called Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's Eve, Valentine's Day, St. Patrick's Day, April Fool's Day, Mother's Day, Father's Day, Independence Day, Roman holiday, Labor Day, and then the final 13th issue is just called Punishment. I point out that in 2021, the storyline was released as two animated movies, Batman The Long Halloween 1 and 2. I haven't watched them. I don't know how well received they've been, but if you are interested, again, in a really thorough Dark Knight Returns kind of look, check out those movies. Now, it's important to remember, or to realise rather, that The Long Halloween had a sequel. I didn't realise this until I was doing this reading. The sequel to The Long Halloween is Dark Victory. Batman Dark Victory is a 14-part comic book series, again written by Loeb, again drawn by Sale. Direct sequel to The Long Halloween and published from 1999 to 2000. And again, it's a murder mystery. It centers on a series of murders involving Gotham City police officers or former police officers by a mysterious serial killer known as the Hangman. So another element of the story is the turf war between Two-Face and the remnants of the mob, led by Sophia Falcone. And the story is also a bit of a retelling of the origins of Batman's sidekick Robin and being adopted by Bruce Wayne. So again, we're already seeing that this is explicitly contradicting the Millerverse stories of All-Star Batman and Robin. So this is what I mean about these stories are going off into their own tangents and doing their own things, and it's very hard to kind of reconcile them. The Millerverse is a relatively closed thing, but extended Dark Knight's Return universe goes off in multitude of different tangents, and just kind of just it requires you to think about it, work out what you want, and just have some mental flexibility about it. By the way, Dark Victory is available as an Absolute Edition, and in fact, The Long Halloween is also available as an Absolute Edition. The Halloween specials we mentioned are also available. Do you know what? We'll talk about that in just a second. Before we go any further, back to Dark Victory. As I said, it's a 14-part comic book series, and it leads straight into Robin Year One. Now, Robin Year One is the title of a DC comic story written by Chuck Dixon. It was originally published in a 4-issue miniseries. It's narrated by Alfred, and again, sort of retells the first year of Dick Grayson as Robin. And that same creative team then went on to make a sequel to Robin Year One, which is Batgirl Year One. So Batgirl Year One is a 9-issue comic maxi series written in 2003. Again, Chuck Dixon and Scott Beatty. And it's about Barbara Gordon's first year as Batgirl. It's a sequel to Robin Year One, and Robin Year One is a sequel to Dark Victory, and Dark Victory is a sequel to The Long Halloween, and The Long Halloween feels very much like it follows on from Batman Year One. So it would seem that all these are sequels, but to be honest, the tone and the tempo and the feel of Batgirl Year One is miles away from the Dark Knight Returns universe. So really what we're finding is a kind of a drift of tone and storytelling, whereas we started off with Year One, and we went through to Long Halloween and Dark Victory and so on. But each sequel is another several steps away from that Miller feel. That's my take on it anyway. Obviously, if you want to read everything, feel free. The sequel to Robin Year One is Batgirl Year One, and as I say, this takes place in the 4th year of modern Batman's career. Robin's been established in the role, and obviously there's a lot of foreshadowing of Barbara Gordon becoming Oracle. With that, let's just take a step back. We talked about Dark Victory just a few moments ago. Well, Dark Victory has another sort of pseudo sequel, not just Robin Year One, and the pseudo sequel called Catwoman When in Rome. And I view this as much more of a pseudo sequel because this is actually written by Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale, whilst Robin Year One and Batgirl Year One were not. So in 2004, Loeb and Sale produced the follow-up, which was called Catwoman When in Rome, which focused on Catwoman's movements in Italy that happened during the period of Dark Victory where she wasn't in any of those issues. So kind of issue 5 to 11, I want to say, give or take. It's a 6-issue series. It takes place, like I say, between Valentine's Day and Thanksgiving, and it accounts for what she was doing during that time. Now, I quite like this story. I quite like her characterization, and it was quite cool. It's another murder mystery story, sort of. So kind of samey in the same sense, but I can totally see why Long Halloween and Dark Victory and this are very popular with the fans. Catwoman When in Rome is collected in an absolute edition with the Halloween Loeb sale one-shots that I mentioned earlier, and this is the absolute edition called Haunted Night. So frankly, if you do want to get those absolute editions, you can actually get the whole Loeb sale series as absolute editions, and that'd be quite nice in your collection. I'm not going to get them because I didn't like the stories enough, but I can see why lots of people do, and obviously you should read them yourself and make up your own mind. Right, wow, there we are. That's a whole series of spin-offs that frankly make very little clear sense as a whole, and in some cases directly contradict either each other or the Millerverse comics that they're meant to be part of. For what it's worth, I tend to view the Millerverse as being the core Millerverse, and then the expanded Dark Knight Returns universe around it is something that I would recommend you just kind of treat like a pick and mix sort of situation. Just pick the stories you like. In your own mind, you can decide what you think is part of the Dark Knight Returns universe or not, and just, be relaxed about it, people. Try and be more like a Type J reader than anything else. So with that, ladies, gentlemen, and others, it's the end of the overview of the both Millerverse and the expanded Dark Knight Returns universe. Hopefully this has been useful. All right, thanks for watching, everybody. As always, please like, comment, subscribe. As always, please follow me on Twitter at I am Thomas Judge, where I will post a daily review of whatever comics I've been reading. You can get an idea of what I'm up to on the channel. And as always, please support the channel by heading over to Amazon.com and checking out my prose novel about superheroes. It's a completely original piece of work. The first episode in it is called Arrivals, and the series as a whole is called No Gods or Kings. You can find an excerpt of that on my website, nogodsorkings.com. Until next time, everybody, stay classy.